Today we're going to take a deep dive on the internet and look at some of the craziest engines that you've probably never even heard of. Now this list includes a little bit of everything, and the last one is absolutely crazy, so you're going to want to stick around. Let's go. Okay, so you know the Suzuki Hayabusa. Suzuki's mammoth of a sport bike that absolutely ruled the streets for years and years, up until the S1000RR and the H2 hit the streets. Well, I'm sure you've seen videos of things like smart cars and go-karts with Hayabusa swaps in them. It might not make any torque, but it sounds cool and can pretty easily make well over 200 horsepower from its 1300 cc's of displacement. But do you know what's better than one Hayabusa engine? Two Hayabusa engines smashed together in one unholy V8. I don't know who comes up with these ideas, because this is both genius and mildly terrifying. Now, the idea of smashing two Hayabusa engines together to make one V8 engine is something that has actually been done by multiple companies with a mixed bag of success. One company that has done this is Radical Sports Cars. You know, the people behind this crazy little rocket of a street legal race car. Well, some of their really crazy customers just simply wanted more power. So what they did is they smashed two Hayabusas together to make a V8. Their base engine is a 2.7 liter V8 that revs up to an insane 10,500 RPM and makes 400 horsepower, with a tuned variant also being available at 440 horsepower. We're talking about the power of a 5 liter Coyote V8 engine from Ford out of a 2.7 liter V8. This is absolutely ridiculous. But for those of you out there with more balls than brains, they also make a 3.2 liter version of this Hayabusa V8 that outputs an absurd 500 horsepower. Now, another company that puts together a Hayabusa V8 is JFC, with their base engine being a 3 liter naturally aspirated engine, outputting 460 horsepower and 280 pound-feet of torque, with a long block that only weighs 200 pounds. I'm not even kidding you, this is an engine that is so lightweight that most people can quite literally deadlift it. But that's not even their top of the line engine. For those of you who are absolute psychos with a very expensive addiction to horsepower, JFC offers their 2.8 liter twin turbo Hayabusa V8 with the same insane rev limit of 10,500 RPM. But with the addition of two turbochargers, they managed to crank the power all the way up to 785 horsepower and 505 pound-feet of torque. All of that in a package that's small enough to shove into just about any car out there. Of course, the biggest problem facing a Hayabusa V8 or any other custom engine that puts two inline engines together to make one V engine is that it generally requires a custom-made block, and that gets pretty expensive pretty fast. Like, really expensive. Generally speaking, these Hayabusa engines range from as low as $30,000 up to well over $50,000. It might not be a $500 junkyard LS 4.8 liter, but for those of you out there who like burning money, there's a Hayabusa V8 out there with your name on it. Alright, that's enough of the Hayabusa V8. It's awesome, it's crazy, but let's take a look at something else, which is actually based on the same principle of smashing two inline engines together to make one V engine, and what better way to do it than with two inline 6 engines to make one V12. And what better engine to base this idea on than the Toyota 2JZ, one of the most hyped up engines of all time. Because if you thought super fanboys couldn't get annoying enough, wait until they find out about the 2JZ V12. Okay, I lied a little. This engine is actually based on the 1JZ and not the 2JZ, but considering how similar they are at the end of the day, we'll just run with it. Now, this ridiculous idea was put together by one mad scientist by the name of Don Groff. I don't think he's actually a scientist, but he's definitely a madman. The earliest bits of this idea can be found on some forums from 2014 with an outline as following: a block made from cutting the bottom end off of two 1JZ engines, a machined, welded, and stress-relieved and aligned bored crankcase with a 120-degree V-angle, a custom-made crankshaft from Scat with small block Chevy main bearings and Honda rod bearings, one cylinder head mounted the wrong way so that the exhaust ports are in the center of the V, and a horsepower target of 800 horsepower. The result is one incredible V12 that sounds surprisingly like a 1JZ or a 2JZ, but with a crazy twist. The final result of all this madness was a pretty impressive power output of 810 horsepower and 700 pound-feet of torque on E85 fuel. Now, I know you might be thinking to yourself that power level seems a little underwhelming, considering there are plenty of 2JZ engines out there making similar amounts of power with half the cylinders of this V12. And while that's true that there are 1Js and 2Js out there making well over 800 horsepower compared to this 2JZ V12 or 1JZ V12, what you're missing is power under the curve, so this is definitely going to make more torque, and it's awesome. Plus, you have to remember that building custom block engines is incredibly expensive, and you'd rather not push the boost to the max and explode your very expensive and time-consuming creation. Could this 1JZ V12 make more power? Probably. Is it worth it? Probably not. Either way, this thing is pretty wild and sounds absolutely incredible. Now this next engine is one that we've actually looked at in depth on this channel about 3 years ago. In fact, in that video, we interviewed the madman behind this creation, Craig Williams. So if you want a really in-depth look at this engine, I'd recommend checking out that video. I'll leave that linked as a video in one of these corners and down in the description below, right below that like button, so you can check that out for yourself. Anyways, what we're looking at here is not just one, but 2 Honda K24 engines stuck together with a custom-made block to create one Honda K48 V8 engine. But this engine is a lot more than just a custom-made block with 2 Honda heads attached to it and smashed together and just made to work. This entire thing from top to bottom is designed with cost, weight, and performance in mind. You see, one of Craig's goals with the K48 is to make it as affordable as possible to one day sell this as a kit to basically whoever wants to buy it. And with that came some unique choices, such as using non-mirrored Honda heads. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, with a typical V8 engine, the entire timing system is either going to be on the front or the back of the engine if it's a really badly designed engine. But with the K48 V8, the timing system is both on the front and the back of the engine. The reason for this design is that one of the heads has to be flipped in order to have the exhaust ports in the center of the V. Rather than designing this engine with a very expensive custom designed cylinder head for one side of the engine, Craig opted to use 2 stock Honda heads and simply turn one around in order to save cost. And that's just one of the many wild features that you'll find on this engine. And in total, this engine has gone through about a dozen massive and major redesigns to get to the point that it's at now. The end goal is to create an engine that produces around 700 to 800 horsepower naturally aspirated from its 4.8 liters of displacement. Now that might sound like a kind of unrealistic and crazy power figure, but when you consider just how well Honda heads flow and the fact that K24s out there are plenty of them making 300 wheel horsepower, it's really not a stretch to see a K48 making 700 to 800 horsepower NA. But unfortunately, Craig Williams, the madman behind this all, has had some pretty severe medical setbacks that have made continuing with this project much more difficult, both physically and financially, as he has been diagnosed with Parkinson's and was told he had anywhere from 5 to 8 years left to live, although another hospital here in Phoenix, where he's from and where we're based, gave him a non-terminal diagnosis and actually said that he's getting better. Regardless of whether Craig's Parkinson's is terminal or not, he has continued working on this project and hopes to bring it to the market soon. Be sure to check out his Instagram, Neutron Engines, where he regularly shares in-depth design changes all the way down to the smallest details. He also sells merch on his website that helps fund this project, so if you want to pitch in, be sure to go check that out too. Okay, so moving on, let's take a look at one of the weirdest automotive engines that I've ever seen, and that's from Volkswagen with their V5 or VR5 engine. Now this is based on the Volkswagen VR6, which itself is a pretty unique and an interesting V6 engine that uses a single cylinder head rather than 2 separate heads. Volkswagen made this possible by reducing the V angle to as little as 10.5 degrees. Now whether or not you want to call this a V6 or a staggered 6 or whatever you want to call it, there's no denying that the VR6 is a very cool and interesting engine. So what way to make it better than to make it worse by lobbing off one of the cylinders to create a VR5? Volkswagen effectively took a VR6 engine and then just removed a single cylinder, leaving behind an engine with 3 cylinders on the bottom bank and 2 cylinders on the top bank. The question though is, why? Why take a VR6 or a V6 and then just lob off a cylinder? What exactly is the point of this? Well, frankly, there aren't really any good answers to that. Part of it is that Volkswagen wanted something between their 4-cylinder engines of the time, which were generally kind of gutless, and their VR6 engine, which was considerably larger and maybe too powerful for some of their commuter type of applications. Now, what's really interesting is that the VR5 actually has the same firing order as an inline 5, but because of the way it's smashed together, you end up with this sort of weird circular firing order. Now, unfortunately, that results in the engine being pretty unbalanced, which ultimately results in some really weird and fairly harsh vibrations that you might not expect in a standard inline 5-cylinder engine, which already isn't great because generally speaking, inline 5s are already pretty unbalanced as compared to, say, something like an inline 6. Either way, the idea of the VR5 is pretty wild, and although it was pretty unsuccessful and barely made it through the 1990s and into the 2000s before Volkswagen killed it off, it's definitely a really cool engine. Now this next engine is yet another engine that we've actually reviewed on this channel before, but it's worth putting into this list because, well, it's awesome. And this is another engine that's based on a 4-cylinder motorcycle engine smashed together into one ungodly V8. Now what we're talking about here is the Synergy V8. But what makes this engine different from the Hayabusa V8 that we looked at earlier is that this engine has actually seen quite a bit of real-world testing and none other than the Subaru BRZ. Because if you thought the BRZ was already lacking on torque, this kind of just makes it even worse. On a more serious note, this engine engine is based on the Kawasaki ZX-12R engine and actually produces more torque than an F820 that you normally find in a BRZ, which isn't particularly hard to do considering that a Milwaukee power tool quite literally makes more torque than an F820, but hey, you know, whatever. Like other custom V8 engines we've covered on this list so far, this engine uses a custom CNC block, but this time around with two Kawasaki ZX-12R cylinder heads bolted up to it. Understandably, the crankshaft is also custom made as it has twice as many pistons to deal with as compared to the standard ZX-12R crank. And because the standard ZX-12R crank is also a flat plane crank, that carries over to this engine as well. Now that all equals out to a pretty impressive power output of 367 horsepower at 10,600 RPM and 200 pound-feet of torque at 8,000 RPM. Now as a company, Synergy does a lot of things outside of obviously just producing this crazy V8 engine. They do a lot of engine design work, development, and a lot more. And for all my Eurobike guys out there, you can rejoice at the fact that they also make this engine with S1000RR heads, and that engine actually makes quite a bit more power than the version with the ZX-12R heads. Other than being awesome, the real benefit to swapping an engine like this in something like a BRZ is the weight savings, with the June BRZ engine coming in 66 pounds lighter than the F820 that they pulled out, plus an even lower center of gravity and obviously more power. And much like the K48 that we looked at earlier, this engine also uses one cylinder head mounted backwards to help save on engine cost, but it's not really like that saved much because a fully dressed package for a BRZ comes in at a whopping $70,000. But to be fair, that's actually not all that bad for a custom built engine that bolts up to your stock transmission and uses almost all of your stock electronics. And more importantly, especially for this kind of money, this thing sounds absolutely incredible. Okay, so as most of you out there know, Subaru has a pretty impressive legacy of rally racing. During the 1990s and 2000s, they were one of the most dominant players in the World Rally Championship. And although they're not nearly as involved in racing as they once were, that racing heritage has helped them sell cars like the BRZ for as long as they have, especially considering the power level hasn't really changed in about 20 years. But what if I told you that they took this even further and tried to venture into the world of Formula One racing? I suppose it's a logical step after their success in rally racing to just step into Formula One racing, but we're talking about a huge jump. And unfortunately, their Formula One engine ended up being one of their worst products ever of all time and one of the worst marks of Subaru's history. Now this engine came as a collaboration between Motori Moderni and Subaru, as Subaru kind of needed someone with Formula One experience to help them get their engines on track and make sure they don't explode in the process. At that point in time, and still to this day, Subaru was best known for their flat 4 boxer engines. So why not just stick with the boxer layout, the typical flat 4 layout that Subaru was known for, and simply just triple it into a flat 12? Well, that's exactly what they did, and what they ended up with was a 3.5 liter flat 12 engine. But unfortunately, the 3.5 liter flat 12 developed by the Subaru Motori Moderni partnership basically took all the negatives of the boxer engine and made it even worse. For one, it was massively heavy, coming in about 250 pounds heavier than a comparable Formula One engine of the time. But that was made even worse by the fact that it only made about 550 horsepower reliably, which was as much as 100 horsepower less than some of their competition. On top of those two problems, which already made this one of the heaviest engines on the field and one of the lowest power engines on the field, the dimensions of it were ginormous, meaning the car that it was destined for, the Formula One car that it was destined for, basically had to have all the aero reworked. And what that meant is not only was this car heavy and slow, it also had less downforce than just about every other car on the field. And understandably, the Subaru F1 car absolutely sucked. After about 8 races of trying to pre-qualify for an event, Subaru called it quits and never returned to F1. So while this engine was a complete failure in just about every single aspect, it's still really cool to think that there are at least a couple of Subaru Formula One flat 12 engines out there somewhere. All right, that's all I've got for you guys today. If you haven't already, be sure to get subscribed. Check out some of the other stuff on the channel. Be sure to drop a comment down below letting me know what other engines you would add to the list and what you want to see in the next video. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. We post a lot on everywhere, and I'll see you guys in the next one.